Hello there, I'm Jason Turvey, the middle-aged revolutionary, and joining me again to review Paul Embery's book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, is my friend and comrade, Terry Eaton. Terry, hello.
Hiya, Jace. All right. Pleased to see you again.
And you. Yes, so as I said, we're reviewing Paul Embery's book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, and this is the fifth part of our review, and we're actually up to chapter 4. And chapter 4 of Paul's book is the case for the nation state. So a nice light topic for us to attack this afternoon. So
Mm.
in summary, what chapter 4 is about is Paul Embery making the case for nation statehood, not only in Britain, but in nations across Europe and elsewhere. And it's a topic that Paul has made mention of frequent times when he's done interviews. I remember an old trigonometry interview he'd done a few years ago where he made the case there for the nation state. And I thought it might be worthwhile, before we really get into the meat of the chapter, to discuss what nation statehood is and what the nation state means. And I'll go by Paul's definition of the nation state first, and then we'll break it down. So, in his book, Paul Embery defines the nation state as a country which is responsible for making their own laws and running their own economies, while promoting trade and cooperating in matters of security with their neighbours and partners. Now, of course, my interpretation of nation statehood is a bit more nuanced than that. That captures it, I think. But I think you have to look at what a nation is, where it sits within the system, particularly with Western imperialism looming over its shoulder, and then what actual nation statehood means for each individual country. So, what I've given as a for instance is, if you were to live in a country like Mali or Niger, both countries which have suffered under the boot heel of French neo-colonialism for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
Nation statehood means the destruction of that neo-colonialism, which I think we're in the process of seeing at the moment in both of those countries. And
Yeah.
with it, the inheritance of the ownership of their own economies, the leadership of which would include the industrializing of the nation, under-industrialized by decades of French dominance. If we look at a place like Palestine, nation statehood would mean the liberation of the Palestinian people from the occupation of their lands by US and British imperialism in the form of the State of Israel.
Mm.
It would mean the founding of a nation state, Palestine, that would be principally independent, able to set its own laws and make alliances with any nation state or states it wishes, much like Paul sets out in his definition. Now, let's turn back now to Britain. So Britain is a subordinate to US imperialism. The last time Britain used its own imperialist might, in contradiction to the interests of the United States, was in 1956, when, along with Israel and France, Britain invaded Egypt to overthrow, or in an attempt to overthrow, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who
Yeah.
was the then president of Egypt, who nationalised the Suez Canal and handed
Mm-hmm.
over control of the canal to a newly constituted state-run canal authority. So the US president at the time, a man called Dwight D. Eisenhower, warned that if the British were to invade Egypt, then he would wreak havoc on Britain by selling the US government's holding of sterling bonds. So basically, he said, if you invade, I'm going to make a run on the pound. I'm going to dump all these sterling bonds I'm holding, and it will completely devalue your currency and you'll be in absolute shit street.
Mm.
So Britain, France, and Israel came under huge pressure from the United States, the USSR, and United Nations to withdraw once they'd invaded. And though they seized control of the canal was closed for 6 months because the Egyptians had blockaded it. The British and French withdrawal was a humiliation for both nations and effectively ended Britain's role as an independent imperialist power.
Mm.
So Britain's alliances with US and EU imperialism are based not on a conscious or willing surrender of sovereignty, as some people might have us believe, but on interests which are rooted in the national interest of this country, but which can and often will align with the interests of other imperialist states. See Israel and Ukraine as two examples. So it's fair to say that whilst it's subordinate to US imperialism, British imperialism even is still strong, but not as strong as US imperialism, which arguably ascended to the top of the imperialist heap between the First and Second World Wars. And certainly US dominance was established in earnest after the Second World War. So to come back to the point about nation statehood in Britain, what would nation statehood look like here? So we'll look at the quote from page 151 later on. But you see that any government desiring to implement any of the proposals that Paul Embery makes in that particular passage, which we'll come to shortly, would have to be backed to the hilt by a strong and active working class. Without that, none of these proposals could be implemented, and if they were, they would be removed in short order. And this is the mistake that all social democrats, including the Social Democrats of the Workers' Party of Britain, make, is that they believe in order to make progressive change in a nation, all that is necessary is for a progressive government to be elected. Indeed, if any progressive government were to be elected, which did have a connection with a strong and active working class to act as its guarantor, why go through the nonsense of reformism when an out-and-out worker-led revolution could take place instead? So just to sort of buttress my point there before we go into the meat and potatoes of the book, progressivism in 2024 in Britain will only ever really happen if there's an active, educated, agitated mass of working class people behind them. Without that, you end up with what you got now, which is the Labour Party in government, reformism without reforms. Okay, that's the long and the short of it. And as I said, if you were a party that was on the cusp of power, that had the backing of the working masses, then why would you need to do it through electoral means? Why wouldn't you just take the whole thing over anyway?
Exactly.
And that's the fundamental point. And this is what social democracy as a thing doesn't quite get its head around, which is that you can't in 2024 reform in and of itself just by being in charge, because there will be, as we saw with Project Corbyn, so much agitation against every single proposal he made. He wasn't even in charge, and they weren't going to countenance anything he was proposing. So imagine what would happen when he was in charge.
Exactly. It would do it and never allowed it. But the thing with Corbyn, isn't there a point where after they'd allowed the Bank of England to decide on interest rates, nowhere did Corbyn say that would change when if he became a leader. Yeah. So you think to yourself, well, he's just capitulating to the imperialists anyway, and the ruling class. Then they turn around and say to him, "You won't do that," and the Yanks would turn around and the big industry say, "You won't do anything like that, because if you do, we'll pull our work out of Britain and we'll take it elsewhere." But the modern Labour Party doesn't help itself, does it really, by the way that it kowtows to other people around the world, apart from the ones that we would expect, a bit of mutual respect with, which would be the Soviet, Russia now, and certainly not America, who they'll just drop us in the shit as soon as look at us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so would the EU.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, we got out of the EU, that's the start. And it should have been, right, we're out of that. Right, now let's get away from this hegemony of America and forge our own way. But the people who were ruling the parties, whether it's Conservative or Labour or whoever, they didn't want Brexit, so they didn't want to do that. So there wasn't any appetite for looking for ways of making an alliance with Russia over the gas.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't be worrying about winter fuel payments if we were getting Russian gas and it was cheap, and we carried on with the oil. Well, it's nation state, like you say. But are we, in that respect?
Yeah, that's right. Well, if take a look at some of the people that were most vociferously anti-European Union, who most pro-Brexit. You know, very, very small number of those people who are pro-Brexit were Marxists, who had a Marxist approach and said, no, there's a reason why we want to leave the European Union because it's a neoliberal, I don't like using that term anymore, but, you know, it's a very capitalist, imperialist trading bloc. That's why we need to get out. And, you know, it would be, to quote someone familiar to us both, it was a significant but in itself insufficient step towards delivering socialism in this country. But then you look at the other groups that made up that pro-Brexit bloc. One of the big ones was what you'd call Atlanticists. So they were people who said, we don't want to be in service to the European Union. We'd much rather be in service to the United States. So it wasn't about not being in service to someone somewhere. It was that you didn't want to be in service to those people, but you'd much rather be in service to these people instead.
Still being in service, isn't it?
Still being in service to someone, you know. And their idea of Brexit was just simply becoming another state of the United States.
Exactly.
And no more.
And that's it. And that to me shines through. People don't see it. A lot of people don't see it. That they had no intentions at all of making Brexit a success.
No, not at all. No.
I mean, I give up now, to be honest, but I'm sick of the whinging on Twitter about it. And then my comment is, well, you know, it was 1975. I've waited nearly bloody 50 years to get out, or 40 odd years to get out. I didn't moan for 40 odd years that I lost. I didn't vote to stay in the EU at the time. So, you know, but we did.
You could argue 1975 was much more underhand, wasn't it? Because the Ted Heath government took us into the European Economic Community, then asked if they could do it.
Yes.
It was that way round, wasn't it? They didn't so it wasn't as if in 2016 we left the European Union and then we held a referendum to ratify the decision.
The vote was to stay in.
Yeah.
Now it's difficult when people when they've given all the bullshit on TV for months after being in there of how great this trading bloc was going to be.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the United States of Europe. This will compete with any nation in the world. And that's what they put over to people. Well, trade unionists didn't fall for that, and they voted out. But obviously there was more of the others than there was of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and on this time it's been reversed for different reasons.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the thing that people like you and I who voted for Brexit, from our political standpoint, one of the things that we've had to do repeatedly for the last 8 years, I think, is to push back against the idea that Brexit was a right-wing thing.
Yeah,
it wasn't. You look at I had this discussion with a chap called Alan Story who runs his own blog on Substack.
Yeah,
and I said, if you look at so-called right-wingers like Margaret Thatcher, for instance, who actually really, looking back now, was more a liberal than a right-winger. But if you look back at people who were framed as right-wingers at the time, no one gave more of Britain's sovereignty away to the EEC and subsequently the EU than Margaret Thatcher. Between 79 and roughly 1990, when Germany reunified, or you had the counter-revolution in East Germany, to call it by its correct term.
Yeah.
So it was only then that the Tory party started to turn. There was always elements within the Tory party that were always anti-EEC, anti-EU. But where it really tipped was when you had the counter-revolution in East Germany and Germany reunified, because all of a sudden the very delicate balance between France, Britain, and West Germany was completely destroyed. You all of a sudden had this enormous 80 million people state, very strong industrially, with both the French and more so the British in decline industrially. No, I mean, to be fair, most of that deindustrialization went on under Thatcher's watch. It went on her watch, and it was completely deliberate. But it was a power struggle between these three states, and then all of a sudden the power balance shifted quite violently towards the unified Germany. And now all of a sudden, Tories were finding themselves in a position where they thought, and maybe this isn't working out so well for us, or maybe we're going to end up getting pushed around a bit more by a unified Germany. And that was what set in train everything that led up to 2016. But it was certainly never, in my view, a right-wing thing, Brexit. There are as many right-wingers who were pro-EU as there were against the European Union.
Exactly.
You know.
Well, it's funny that when we, just to interrupt you, it's funny that when we came together at the beginning, forming the Workers' Party, and we all were of the same view, Brexit. We'd all voted Brexit.
Yeah.
You, me, other colleagues that we met with and met in Birmingham. So that there was a commonality there between us. So that we're not right wing. None of them were right wing.
Exactly.
But as Embery says, the left, not the pseudo left, but the left, I would say, in looking at it left and right from the 70s, say, well, you knew where you were. They missed the chance there to, as he says, I think later on in the book, to grasp that Brexit with both hands and set, but instead they called it a right wing escapade, and that they were with a bunch of charlatans.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're still saying it now.
Well, exactly. And the roots of that go back to around about 1988 when Jacques Delors made a speech to the TUC Congress, where he essentially said to them, look, lads, I know you got your heads kicked in by Thatcher a couple of years back. The best way you can guarantee the rights of your members is to go all in on the European Union. That's the best way to do it. You're not going to win fighting Thatcher in Britain. So come on board with us. Come on board with us in the European Union, and we'll protect your workers' rights.
Try and fight Thatcher in Britain and the rest of them in Europe.
Exactly.
Well, do you remember, just as an aside, do you remember when Euro communism reared its head? And this was like, so to me, I looked at that. I read a couple of books on it. I looked at it and I thought, this smacks of just appeasing left-wing militants to say, right, we can have a Euro communist bloc here if you all go down this route. And you know damn well it's never going to happen. You're never going to go to meetings. I've never been to one meeting in France or Germany or anywhere else.
Exactly. Exactly.
And as regards the bollocks of freedom of movement and screaming about, when was the last time I remember going to get a job in Paris? I don't ever remember doing it.
Yeah.
So you stay in your own country. I don't care unless your job's up here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's important to remember when people talk about freedom of movement, the European Union enshrines not just the freedom of movement of people, but of money and goods. We are just a commodity alongside those two other things. We are equal in the eyes of the ruling class of the European Union. We are equally useful as goods and money. That's why they encourage this freedom of movement, because it's about the movement of capital and goods. But let's be clear. If you was to go outside now and ask 20 people in the street whether they would up sticks and move to, I don't know, Estonia, they probably wouldn't.
No.
Because there's no way that they could make a living that's comparable in terms of cash value in Estonia as they could here. Because if they could, then hundreds of thousands of Estonian people wouldn't have left Estonia when they joined the European Union.
Exactly. That's what I say. Well, if it's so great in these other countries, why are they all here?
Yeah. For some people, freedom of movement has been the opportunity to up sticks, go somewhere else and make a better life for themselves. And there's absolutely nothing in and of itself wrong with that. But there are other people who can't use freedom of movement because it would plunge, if they did the opposite journey, it would plunge them into poverty.
Yeah.
And no one's going to move into poverty. Migration is never about whether it's human beings migrating or animals migrating. It's never about going somewhere worse than where you are.
No.
It's always about trying to go somewhere better than where you are. So to say you've got the freedom of movement, I mean, the only argument, not the only argument, but the argument that kept coming up in the trade union I was in at the time of Brexit was well, it'd be a pain in the ass when you go abroad, wouldn't it? And it's like, so a couple of times a year you might go on holiday, you might have to wait longer at passport control, and that's the reason to be part of an imperialist trading bloc, is it?
Yeah.
It's about all the reason that they could come up with was the logistic nightmare potentially of going across borders when you're on holiday or when you're traveling or whatever else. It's it was always very difficult, especially for the trade union movement, to sell the EU to the workers because there was very, very little in terms of net benefit to the workers. Very little, you know. In fact, what they saw, particularly during the late 90s, early noughties, when the whole of the old Eastern Bloc joined the European Union, was what they saw was a huge wave of immigration, and these people were very well educated because they were educated in the Eastern Bloc, could all speak good English, and in a lot of cases were prepared to do virtually any job in order to help them settle here, which was in some cases better than what we had. We might have had people who were willing to work, but maybe not work in every job. We might have had people who were educated, but certainly not educated to the level that they were. And of course, that caused
No.
all kinds of ructions amongst working class people, obviously with some agitation coming in from outside as well. But it never ended well, and it was never meant to end well.
Yeah. I think all the ill-educated British people are all in Parliament.
Well, as we said at a previous episode, you know, the number of MPs with law degrees, you
Oh
know,
yes, that's the one.
esteemed people like David Lammy and Richard Burgin, for example.
Oh my
You
God,
know,
David.
two of the wisest people I've ever come across in Parliament. Wonderful, wonderful people. You know, they devalue the work that you have to put in to get a law degree. That's all I'll say.
Yes, they do.
And on that bombshell, we'll move on to the text of the book. So we're going to begin. I'm going to abridge this because it is quite a long quote, but this is a page 138 to 140. So I've abridged it thus. The attack on the concept of nationhood has been deliberate and purposeful. It has been spearheaded for different reasons by two groups of people who saw the nation state as a roadblock to the implementation of their ideology. First, the financial globalizers, those wedded to the precepts of neoliberal economics, namely the chiefs of the multinationals and banks, the international investors, and those with political power who support their ideology. This group, by definition, seeks ever greater reductions in regulation, less government intervention, lower taxes, fewer barriers to the movement of capital, restraint on trade union power, more flexibility in the global labour market, the rolling back of the frontiers of the state, that is, within and between states, more powerful supranational institutions, and less for elected politicians of national parliaments. In short, they want access all areas in pursuit of higher profits and greater share of the market. The second group are the political and cultural globalizers, the progressive purveyors of the kind of liberal cosmopolitan liberalism which, as we have seen, has created a schism between ordinary working class voters and their rulers in Britain, and explains the increase in support for populist movements and politicians throughout much of Europe and the United States. These people, often labelled, much to the irritation of some of them, citizens of nowhere, deeply suspicious of anything but the most dispassionate relationship with the nation state, associating patriotism with sentiments of chauvinism and dislike of Johnny Foreigner, and viewing it as a hindrance to their brand of internationalism, which is built around the notion of a liberal utopia unencumbered by such outmoded concepts as borders and sovereignty. They contend that sentiments of national pride and belonging must by definition be exclusionary, for it is simply impossible to hold such positive feelings about one's own country without harbouring hostility or ill will towards others. So if we were to look at the first block of people that Paul Embery identifies, the financial globalizers, and examine the list of things that Embery says that they seek: ever greater reductions in regulation, less government intervention, lower taxes, fewer barriers to the movement of capital, restraint on trade union power, and so on. Let's have a look at Paul's own position on this. So in August 2022, Paul Embery tweeted, and I quote, "Profit making is legitimate, profiteering is immoral. Some of our big companies, especially the energy giants, are now guilty of the latter. It needs to be stopped." So let's have a look at profit.
Mm.
How is profit, which Embery describes as legitimate, made? It's made ostensibly through the exploitation of workers, both here and abroad, through the wages system. If we accept for a moment that making a profit is indeed legitimate, as Paul Embery says, then at what point does profit become profiteering? Are there any gradations of legitimacy in making shoes in a factory in this country, for instance, for which a worker gets a living wage, as opposed to making shoes in a sweatshop in a foreign land by a child labourer? To the worker here and the child there, yes, there is a distinction in the manner in which they're both treated. But to the capitalist, the primary driving force is where maximum profit can be gained, and there is no such thing as profiteering. The capitalist will charge exactly what he thinks the market will bear. The state in and of itself cannot challenge neoliberalism because the state is the guarantor of neoliberalism, or imperialism to give it its correct term. The state acts to manage the conflicts between the owners of the means of production and those exploited for the creation of profit. If the state were to side with the worker time and time again, then the system would be mortally wounded and would eventually collapse. That's why the state always will side with the owners of the means of production. It exists to prop up the system, not to challenge it. The second group, the cultural ones, a little bit more interesting. So the people that Embery describes in this passage are ostensibly middle class, often university educated, often part of the professional managerial strata of the middle class, often members of the Labour Party and a trade union, and in some cases hold positions within either or both. People like this misidentify imperialist entities like the EU as internationalists, and I've heard that said to me in a discussion with some trade union comrades. They said, "I'm voting to remain because I'm an internationalist," and are extremely uncomfortable with open acts of patriotism, including or particularly English acts of patriotism. And this cohort looks to organisations like the EU as some sort of antidote, like we were saying earlier about the Jacques Delors speech, an antidote to what they perceive as the worst elements of Englishness, and will send their children to study in mainland Europe in order to avoid them being indoctrinated in anything remotely British or English. The second group has very little time for Britain and essentially could live anywhere it wanted if it had the means, motive, and opportunity to do so. They have very little in the way of roots in or attachment to this country. So, unfortunately, we've got a situation where Embery has clubbed these people into two main groups. One that seeks to make profit and one that seeks to undermine the culture. Like I said, I thought the second group was a bit more interesting to examine because I've come across these people in the trade union movement, funny enough. Almost anti-British or anti-English in their positions. Very, very little in the ways of ties to this country, although they don't leave, they stay here, but they send their children abroad to university and things like that. In fact, I remember discussing with one person who was pro Remain. That was partially why they wanted to do it, because they wanted to send their kids abroad to university. So what were your thoughts on this particular passage and the two groups that Paul Embery has distilled this issue down into?
I'm more likely to go along with you, sir, because the financial those people, the financial ones, they don't really give a monkey's about us anyway. The ones that are the international investors, they own they own the political power. It's like saying, what was it, a transfer of power from the ballot to the boardroom, which was a quote that I saw, and it is because they're not interested in the political side of it, what we say, what we could have, the parliament. They'll just decide, well, this is how we want to finance it. This is how the finance is going to work. If you don't like it, lump it,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
The second group, as you say, seems to have covered a hell of a lot of people who are middle middle class, perhaps higher to higher, who can turn around and have the luxury of saying, well, maybe they're a banker, maybe they're a lawyer. They can have the luxury of saying, well, I'm sending my children abroad because we don't want them brushing shoulders with these rough at the edge working class types,
Mm.
and send them to a private school in France where they'll come all nice and rounded and just come back and be they'll end up being the parasites of society as they quote we are.
Yeah.
That Badenoch said that we were was it her said that we were parasites if we were on benefits. One of them, I think
Yeah.
it was her.
I think it was. Yeah.
And like that's the attitude those people have in my view. That yeah, they're not interested in Britain. It's a place to live, and if they want to go and live somewhere else, they can.
Yeah. There's a I mean, I think it's a distinction that Paul is making repeatedly during the book. Is this difference between right? So let's go to fundamental basics here. He thinks that most of the modern left are a cabal of ostensibly middle class, university educated, liberal minded people who have no, I don't want to say no roots in this country, but they don't. He uses the word belonging quite a lot in the book, and he uses the word belonging quite a lot when he's doing interviews and stuff as well. And he's using that word to make a distinction between the people that he's criticizing here and working class people. So he says that working class people have got a much greater sense of belonging, of place, of community, and things
Of,
like that.
of
We've discussed this before. I think there's still an element of truth in that. I do. But in terms of what we're talking about here with this second group, this internationalist group, if you like, to use a phrase, these people do not have that sense of belonging. They do not have that sense of community or identity or of putting roots down somewhere and staying there for a long time.
no,
And these are people for whom it could be Britain, but it could be anywhere. If they could overcome perhaps the language barrier, or perhaps have a bit more money, or if they had more money behind them, then they might be able to up sticks and go to south of France, or up sticks go to Spain, or up sticks go to anywhere else in mainland Europe. But I think the point he's making about the second group is more to distinguish it from the working class than anything else. It's to say, we've got working class people of all these things that keep them rooted in an area, and then here are these people, and like you said, some of these people end up probably as MPs, some of these people might end up as trade union bureaucrats, who knows, you know.
yeah,
But they
yeah.
have little time for Britain, as Paul Embery says. They have very little time for Britain, and essentially could live anywhere if they had the means, motive, and opportunity.
We come back to class. Then see, it is class, isn't it? That's
Yeah,
that's what
yeah, it is. Yeah,
that's how it boils down to. Simply, they.
absolutely.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with being proud of the country you're from. Nothing at all. It's not. You don't have to be a Nazi or anything. You just say, I'm proud to be British or proud to be English or proud to be Welsh, whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't mean to say that everybody else is rubbish
No,
compared to you. Like he's
no,
saying here,
and that's what he says, isn't it?
yeah,
He identifies this group, this second group,
mm,
as anyone who says they're proud to be British must be chauvinistic as well. They must not only love Britain but loathe everywhere else.
yeah.
And it's quite wrong to identify patriotism. I think the problem is, and I wonder if I think we've touched on this before, but there is a an almost bourgeois patriotism where that chauvinism is baked in the cake. I don't think there's any two ways about it. There is a certain kind of bourgeois patriotism that says not only are you proud of your own country, but you look down your noses at everyone else. That's
Yes,
certainly true. But whether that manifests itself in the working class in terms of the patriotism that they might have, I'm not so sure.
but I don't think it does. With like you just said, yeah, I don't think that working people look down the nose at other people, other countries, or other people from different lands. They don't look and say we're better than you. because we're in the same shit mess that they are in their
Mm.
country if they're
Yeah,
working class.
yeah,
They've got
exactly.
their bureaucrats and their bourgeoisie who are doing exactly the same to them as what ours are doing to us here. That's capitalism, isn't it? That's and until that class realizes that we'll just keep going around the treadmill.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Okay, with that, we'll. The only thing I wanted to say was I'll touch again on this first block, the financial globalizers. I don't I don't necessarily believe that there is such thing as a, a conscious movement towards globalization in the West. What I think there is in the West is a collection of states who have very, very closely aligned interests
Mhm.
that gives the appearance of globalization, but essentially they're all acting in their own interests. It's just that a lot of the time their interests line up. So, for
Yeah.
instance, you've got look at the West's attitude to the special military operation in Ukraine. There is almost no state, perhaps with the possible exception of maybe Hungary and possibly Serbia, that is not all in on the meat grinder that's operating at full pelt in the Ukraine at the moment and throwing Ukrainian soldiers into it head first. Then I'm not interested in sending any soldiers from the United States or from
No,
here.
no, no.
That is, until until the last Ukrainian is gone is
Well, they
basically how long
kill
they'll
all
have
the
this war
working
going.
class in the Ukraine is what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, but it's there's a lot of conspiracy theories going around and lots of commentary of the ilk that there is this Bill Gates, Elon Musk kind of cabal of people like Spectre out of James Bond that
It's
are
the Illuminati, then.
the Illuminati, the one world government, and all this stuff. Um, I don't think we're there quite yet. I think what you have though is that you have and we were talking about this earlier with regard to Britain and France. Britain and France at one point were quite powerful imperialist states in their own right. Their power has diminished over the
Mm.
decades. America has become the preeminent imperialist state, and most, in fact, if not all, imperialist states are in one way or another subordinate to the United States.
Yeah.
The last time Britain and France were able to do anything off their own back, in Britain's case was 56. France could argue maybe 2003 when it refused to involve itself in the illegal invasion of Iraq, was probably the last time it had any nominal independence, and that's gone. That was 21 years ago.
Mm.
So I don't think we're quite there in terms of globalization yet. What we have, though, is a lot of very subordinate states all dancing to one nation's tune, which is the United States.
Yeah, it is.
So
Sadly.
moving on, page 142, and I'll quote from the book. The COVID-19 pandemic threw into sharp relief how a deepening interconnectedness and over reliance on global supply chains, such as those providing personal protective equipment for health workers, had the capacity to undermine government responses to such crises, and demonstrated how the principle of a nation state supporting its own industrial and manufacturing base within the framework of a national economy was suddenly relevant again. So, in a socialist state, the repatriation of industry and manufacturing will be eminently more possible because the profit motive will be relegated to the bottom of the list of considerations if it's on the list at all. And any worker state would make in planning their economy. However, right here, right now, we don't live in a worker state, and so the desire to bring supply chains and manufacturing back to this country is frankly wish casting. Because let's look at Trump. Let's look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump promised when he was last president from 2016 to 2020 that he would repatriate certain industries. And what that actually amounted to was throwing government money at companies to make them build factories and produce
Yeah.
goods in the United States. The thing that some or a lot of social democrats, in fact, don't understand is that under imperialism, what you're looking to do is to offshore almost everything in terms of capital, in terms of the production of goods, and so on. So you end up with what you have in this country, which is predominantly a service-based economy.
Yeah.
Okay. You have very little goods manufactured in this country. If you go into any clothes shop, you will see clothes made in Bangladesh. You will see clothes made in Sri Lanka. You will see clothes made in Vietnam. Now, all of those clothes were made by human beings, but it's cheaper to have human beings in Vietnam or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh make them than it is to have people in this country make them. That's why we've offshored everything and reshoring it. Well, I mean, I'm reminded of something that Alex says on the Marx Engels Lenin Institute live streams many, many times. You cannot reshore production of goods in this country because private capital will not invest in this country. There is no return in this country. That's why they don't do it. That's why, I'll give you a good example. Under Rishi Sunak's chancellorship, when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he brought in provisions to encourage companies to be more green, to invest in green technology. And he gave them a carrot and a stick.
Mm.
The carrot was, if you invested in green technology, we wouldn't tax you so hard. The stick was, if you don't invest in it, we'll tax you harder. And almost to a man, every single company just paid more tax because they knew that it would be cheaper to just pay the tax to the state. And I dare say Rishi Sunak probably knew this too, but it was cheaper for them to pay the tax than it was to invest in green technology because the rate of return is so low. So the only way you're going to re-establish manufacturing in this country, excuse me, is for the state to either completely underwrite it or to give huge tax breaks to companies to elicit them to build factories. So a good example that just popped in my head, I'm going back to the 80s now, was the DeLorean factory that was built in Belfast.
Yeah.
And John DeLorean built that factory there because Thatcher gave him enormous tax breaks to build cars there. Yeah. And the government at the time thought, well, maybe part of the reason why there's so much trouble in that particular part of the world is because it's quite deprived. Actually, it was probably arguably the troubles that created the deprivation, not the other way around. But by making everyone prosperous, they would forget all their differences and, you know, march out of the troubles and into a new dawn. But of course, you know, it didn't work out quite that way. But they threw money at it like there was no tomorrow.
Mm.
Even when those cars were not selling, even while the company was tanking, they were still giving DeLorean the tax breaks he needed.
Well, that's what I said.
Sorry,
go on. No, you're all right. Carry on.
No. I was just going to say that it's like a lot of phenomena in the West. The only answer the state has got is to throw money at it.
Yeah.
There's no other way of doing it. You know, anyone who cannot understand why we make virtually nothing in this country does not understand how imperialism works.
But they've been carving this up since the Treaty of Rome in 57. Yeah. Because they've looked at it and they've said, right, Britain, banking, finance services, France, farming, big, massive land, Germany in this big industry, shipbuilding, engineering. How many engineering companies? I don't know. There probably are some have closed down, but not a damn sight more than compared to what happened in Britain. The decimation of shipyards, docks.
Yeah.
Even the trains can't run because the guys don't want to work overtime. Now, if you haven't got enough people in your company to cover all the trains, there's something wrong without having to work overtime.
Yeah.
So obviously, to nationalise something like like you've said previously, when they nationalised the rail, it's because it was a disaster, and
they were forced to.
Forced to do it. Whereas now you'd have to have some kind of government, which I said earlier on, the transfer of power has gone from the ballot box, which is us voting our leaders in, to the boardrooms where they say, fuck what Starmer says. This is what's going to happen. And if he comes the big I am, we'll shut Vauxhalls down. Like we said over Fords in Dagenham,
Yep.
gradually reduced it down, make cars in Spain or elsewhere around the
Yep.
world, and just use it as a component place for
Yes.
assembly. I mean, it's plain. My generation is the ones that had the prosperity from the big industries like your car industries, your oil industries, Shells. I worked in it in the oil industry. So we had prosperity then, and it's gradually gone downhill
Yeah.
ever since
Yeah.
the 60s, late 60s, 70s.
Absolutely. I mean,
That was
you,
the
you
chance.
absolutely. You can go to virtually any provincial town in the country, and you will see at least one housing development that was built on the site of an old factory.
Yep.
So, where I live, there used to be an ironworks called Crittles. Crittles used to make things like window frames and all kinds of
Mm.
other things. Um, long since gone, long since demolished, and all that stands to remind you that it was there is like a board that's up outside this housing development to give you a bit of history of Crittles when it was there. And that's not isolated to just my town. There are towns all over the country where that's happened.
Oh
And
yeah, this definitely mine's the same.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got the towns that had coal mines. Coal mines obviously were all closed, mainly in the 1980s. You know, it rips the heart out of a community to have that disappear. But the point is, once they go, those industries, they are never coming back.
No,
Never, never.
no,
And in deindustrialization, as Lenin wrote in his book Imperialism, the final stage of capitalism, the uh, the deindustrialization in this country probably began at the end of the 19th century and has been progressively going on ever since.
mm,
America's been in deindustrializing for decades. Anyone who's familiar with the area of Virginia, where they call it the Rust Belt, where
yeah,
all the factories and the steel mills used to exist and now they've all gone, will know, deindustrialization is part of the process. In simple terms, capitalism knows that you need some money to start a business, and then you turn that money into commodities, and then you sell those commodities and you get money. And that money goes back into the cycle until you go money, commodity, money. And what capitalism wants is to cut the commodity bit out. So you go from money to money, and you make money into more money by the single biggest sector we have in this country, which is the finance sector based in the City of London,
yeah,
where no one there is making anything, no one there is producing anything, but they are still making billions and billions and
yeah.
billions of pounds every single day, every single month, every single.
That's what always makes people ask, well, how can we be the sixth richest nation in the world when we don't, all our factories are shut? And I say, well, the reason is because of the banking,
Yes,
finance.
yeah,
Finance is
finance
making money. It,
capital.
it just fills the books up with the zero signs. That doesn't help it when they're using the money that they've got in government to pay benefits for people that are on the dole because they've shut the factory down.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So,
Yeah, and from the capitalist point of view, it's important to keep a small number of people, percentage wise, a small number of people unemployed, the reserve army of labour, as Marx called it, because
uh,
that the capitalists can use that small group of workers as a pull on wages. You can draw down wages by saying, well, if you don't want to work for this sort of money,
oh,
they will because they're
yeah,
unemployed. The
well,
problem comes is when you have too much unemployment, you haven't got enough people earning who are not having their wages creamed off for profit, and then they're not putting their own money back into the system.
mm,
And that's why having a certain number of unemployed people is vital for capitalism. But when it goes too far either way, capitalism finds itself in a spot of bother.
yes,
But
as it did in the 80s. I can
exactly,
remember managers saying, well, if your lads don't want to do this work, there's 3 million people out there. Will I said, no, there
exactly.
isn't.
No,
We've got you. We had a union. I said, get
yeah,
it in your Swede. There's a union here. But now, when they say that to people who work in factories, regatta. Well, if you don't want this minimum wage, then go somewhere else.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I mean that speaks to the the countervailing force of the old trade union movement, like you were saying in the 70s and 80s, where they could actually compete on equal terms with employers. I'm not so sure. They definitely can't now. I mean, you only
No.
have to look at. I'll go back to the Royal Mail dispute. You look at the people in charge of the CWU at the time of that dispute. They said it themselves. We had to back out of the strike because we were worried Royal Mail was going to go into administration.
Yeah. Do you know, just as a quick one, you've mentioned Royal Mail. I'm in a group called Post Workers Say No. This was to the right, to private, right from privatisation now, the rise last time with the dispute. There's a guy in Durham. He's been 31 years in the post office. He's been sacked for delaying the company, the Royal Mail. And the union, he hadn't delayed the mail. But anyway, you've got to know the ins and outs of what that means. But the fact remains that he's an experienced man. And to me, they will just get rid of them as they have. If they can't get enough volunteers for early retirement, so they can pay them off, and then they can mould the new lot. People come in on 0-hour contracts and got them working Sundays and shifts in the evening, delivering mail and crap like that. Who wants to deliver mail at 6 o'clock on a winter's frigging night? But anyway, that's where they're heading, and it's a total ruination. Now, this lad, the group, this independent group, is trying to take his case up, but the leaders of the CWU and his union rep have said you haven't got a leg to stand on. Now, I tweeted, knowing Royal Mail management as I do, that's the sort of underhanded thing they will do to get rid of the long-serving staff without having to pay them off. The guy obviously doesn't want to leave. He looked like
Yeah.
he was in his 50s. So he's probably thinking too early to retire. I'll do another 5 years and I'll go. Maybe he's 55. I'll go because you get your pension at 60 in Royal Mail anyway. But and it just shows you the way that gradually the decline and all that we're talking about here results in that sort of thing being happened, which would never have been allowed to have happened in the 70s or 80s or even the 90s. No matter whether Thatcher made trade union laws, they still wouldn't have done that
Yeah,
in the Royal
exactly.
Mail anyway.
Exactly. I mean, actually, you mentioned the pension rang a little bell in my mind, which was that the way in which Royal Mail was privatised was quite interesting because, and I think it's been done before with other old public sector employers when they were privatised. In Royal Mail, they didn't privatise the pension fund. The
No.
pension fund is still underwritten by the government, as far as I'm aware.
The
So,
old pension fund, yeah, there's two. There
right,
might be three now. So new starters who came. I'm on two Royal Mail pensions, the old one and the one that they introduced maybe 2 or 3 years before I left. But as people come in, new people, the pension scheme's different. It's not the old deal. They want to get rid of all the people on that old deal because it's a good pension scheme. So if they can get shut of them, they aren't going to pay any. If they can sack someone,
mm,
that's
yeah,
it. You've gone gross misconduct, nothing, all that business.
mm.
So that's just the way it's gone, isn't it? But yeah,
Yeah, yeah. But I think the point I was making with not privatising the pension fund was the state had to sweeten the pill to get anyone to buy Royal Mail. Anyone who was investing in
oh
Royal
yeah,
Mail shares did not want to be on the hook for underwriting the pension fund. Because if the pension fund
yeah.
would go under, they would have to, or the company would be the sponsor, as they're
When they
called.
floated the Royal Mail shares, they told the postman, "You'll all get." I forget how much it was. 300 shares. I can't remember. I found, and you couldn't sell them for like 3 years or
That's
something.
right. Yeah.
Um, now they valued the shares at £3.20. The hierarchy and the rich bought thousands and thousands and thousands of shares. Then they said Royal Mail is now successful and profitable. The shares went up to over £5, £6. Those I got rid of my shares, to be honest. It went up at the time. I said, I'm getting rid because I know what's going to happen here. And I got something like £6 a share because I didn't want shares anyway. But they gave us up as part of the pay deal.
Mm.
And But the rich ones who had 10,000 blocks of shares, they were getting double the money than what they bought them for. So that's just another rip-off, bloody.
Of course.
Just sign a check, get 10,000 shares, and then revalue them in 6 months' time at £6 a share, and then we'll sell them. And then it, bam, right back down to £3
Yeah,
odd.
that's right. Exactly.
Rip off. Yeah,
Exactly.
well.
Just pause. So we'll move on then to the bottom of page 147. Now, this is Embery writing on the phenomenon of working class resistance to the ravages of imperialism in imperialist countries. And I should point out again, I have abridged this for brevity.
Yeah. I won't read it off the book. I'll just read it off the sheet.
Yeah, exactly.
Notes.
So it says here, a quote, "Yet, for the most part, these movements did not appear to be out of a clear blue sky and are not driven as they were in the 1930s by any sense of superiority, still less an aggressive expansionism or hostility towards other nations. On the contrary, they are defensive by nature and defined by a desire amongst ordinary citizens to defend what they have or reclaim what they have lost in the way of democracy, national self-determination, identity, and economic and cultural security, as well as a recognition that if things are to change for the better, the peddlers of neoliberal globalization, in many senses, the architects of their plight, must be confronted. A prime example of such a movement is the Gilets jaunes in France. Formed in 2018 in protest at rises in the price of fuel and the cost of living under the centrist government of Emmanuel Macron, the movement quickly grew and expanded its demand to include greater economic justice, including a higher minimum wage and an end to austerity, and a strengthening of democracy, such as by way of citizens' initiative referendums. It was a genuine anti-globalization movement, grassroots-led, comprised mainly of working class people, and infused with a patriotism redolent of its historical French revolts. Every Saturday, thousands of protesters wearing their yellow vests and waving their tricolour would march through cities and towns across France, with each new demonstration designated the latest act in a drawn-out play. Naturally, the European left saw the movement as anything but inspiring and did its best to distance itself from the protesters. The Gilets jaunes were just a bit too working class and rough around the edges. For its part, and this is a bit I 100% agree with because it's absolutely true. For its part, the voice of the British trade union movement, the Trade Union Congress, offered not a single word in solidarity. Individual trade unions also remained silent. These liberal workers were off limits. Oh, sorry, these particular workers were off limits. Their ideas conflicted with the progressive, cosmopolitan, liberal worldview to which much of the movement in Britain today is wedded. And so, just a little bit of a sort of critique of the Gilets jaunes. They were quite ill-formed. They had a very, very small list of demands, and that list of demands grew quite exponentially. When I say formed, they had no leadership. There was no vanguard party to speak of, which is possibly, in fact, probably why it spun out of control and ended up dying as a movement. But it also speaks to, or the formation of the Gilets jaunes speaks to, the syndicalist element within the French working class.
Yeah.
The fact that French workers have traditionally come to the aid of other workers in strife, often not union members at all, not even part of the trade union movement. Trade union movement in France is roughly a little under half the size it is in Britain, and yet because of this strong syndicalist tradition that they have, workers will join movements against the ruling class. The problem is that without a vanguard party, without a group of workers who can lead it, that's why these things end up derailing very, very quickly, in my view.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah,
sorry. The reaction of the left and the trade union movement in this country on the Gilets jaunes is very instructive. Perhaps in part because of the strong Trotskyite influence which continues to endure in these movements, and that these Trotskyite tendencies will always take an idealist view of worker-led movements. including the Gilets jaunes and the Canadian truckers' protests, which are not mentioned by Embery in the book because the truckers' protest came after the book was
Yeah.
published. Now, I remember going off my script a little. I remember being on it was like one of those Sunday morning lefty Zoom things. I was encouraged. I think this was still when I was in the Workers' Party. I was encouraged to pop along and participate. So I found myself in the chat typing away, and I mentioned something about the Canadian truckers, and someone who I know was of a Trotskyite persuasion said, "Those people are far right fascists. We should not be supporting them." And the idea that the Canadian truckers were far right fascists was a line peddled by Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. He was the one that accused them of being far right fascists shortly before he froze their bank accounts, I should add.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's malignant forces within the left and the trade union movement itself in this country, mostly of a Trotskyite persuasion, but not necessarily always of a Trotskyite persuasion, who
Yes.
will seek purity all the time in workers' movements. And where they don't see that purity, they condemn it straight off the bat. It doesn't matter that these are working class people, you know, protesting like they were in France or protesting like they were, and they had legitimate concerns in Canada, legitimate
They did.
concern. They were criticised not only because they were peddling the same line that Justin Trudeau did about them being fascist. Oh, but they own their rigs. They own the means of production. They're not working class. You know, you can't be a truck driver without a truck. And they were not exploiters of anyone else. They owned their means of production because they owned. It's no different to a peasant owning their own little scrap of land. They owned a truck because they were truck drivers and they needed to have the truck to do the
Yeah,
truck
and I
driving.
think you'll probably find that every truck driver in Canada owns their own truck.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
don't work for
exactly.
fleets of companies with trucks anymore. It's not like, these tankers driving for Shell or something. They're all paid by Shell and they drive tankers for Shell. These guys are buying rigs 100 grand a go
Yeah,
to
yeah.
ply their trade.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You
And
know,
this was something that was particularly true of the Trotskyite version of the left, in that they were deeply critical of of the Canadian truckers in particular, but also the Gilets jaunes as well. You know, and they were not able, and the left and the trade union movement is not able to just see a working class movement for what it is, a working class movement. They have to look into the detail, to look between the lines, to find a way to disassociate themselves with it. And
yeah,
as Embry said, the TUC said nothing about the Gilets jaunes,
not a
nothing,
word.
not a
No, they
word.
didn't.
And the entire trade union movement said
And
nothing.
you hardly saw it on TV.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, it was not covered at all on the
No,
television. I
you'd have
think
to
it might
look
have
at.
been the first couple of times, and then as
Yeah,
it,
it was, and that's it gone. But you'd probably you could find
yeah,
it on Al Jazeera or somewhere else. You'd get
yeah,
it on channels like that.
exactly, exactly. So just to return to the notes, in the cases of the Gilets jaunes, it was that there were elements within them. This is just tying on from
Yeah,
the left attacking the Canadian truckers. It was that there were elements within them that were allegedly racist. It was also that some of those marching were petty bourgeois employers who closed their businesses and made their workers join them on marches for no pay. In the case of the Canadian truckers, it was that they were petty bourgeois because they owned their rigs, as I said, or that they were
yeah,
dominated by the far right, or even that they were breaking the accepted left narrative on COVID-19, which in itself was completely opportunist, and compelling people to take experimental vaccines, the efficacy of which is now rightly questioned. In
correct.
general, the left and the trade union movement often behaves in this way. It ignores the threat that these movements pose to imperialism and instead search for reasons to avoid supporting them and on occasion actively oppose them in their struggles. In
Mm,
reality, the left and the trade union movement, particularly at the most senior levels, act in the interests of imperialism. And
mm,
that's the fundamental point, isn't it? Is that you have to look at a movement, be it the Gilets jaunes, the Canadian truckers, or perhaps even Brexit, and you say to yourself, right, what does this do to imperialism in that particular country? Does Canadian imperialism be damaged by Canadian truckers blockading streets, blockading key bridges across from Canada into the United States. Do they damage imperialism? Are the Gilets jaunes undermining imperialism by doing their marches every Saturday, by bringing out workers with them and so on? And then you look at Brexit in this country. Does Brexit potentially damage British imperialism? And the answer, if the answer is yes, then you should support those causes, regardless of how ragged they might be or how unfocused their goals are. You should still support them.
Yeah.
Because they weaken imperialism in that particular country.
Correct.
And the fact that the trade union movement and the left didn't do that means that they're acting, whether they like it or not, and whether they understand it or not, they act in the interest of imperialism.
I think they understand it. The leaders of our unions and TSU understand it very well, what they were doing, what they do. They could have shown solidarity. It did not mean they were going to call on a general strike in Britain, but they could have made a statement to say, that we stand with the Gilets jaunes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But not a squeak.
Not a squeak.
The thing is, as well, I think he says in the passage, I don't know if you're going to come to it, but he mentions they're quick enough to stand by Cuba or Venezuela, something that's thousands of miles away that they haven't really got to do. But they'll send a delegation to Havana, or to the bloody Caracas to meet with their people. But they couldn't be asked popping over the tunnel to France.
Yeah, that's right. It is odd, isn't it? Because it shows in a way that certainly in the trade union movement, internationalism is very selective, isn't it?
Yes.
Quite rightly, you should support causes like being against the genocide taking place in Gaza. You should be supportive of the Cuban Revolution. You should be supportive of Maduro in Venezuela. But you should also be supportive of things a little closer to home, or things that are actually on the doorstep of Western imperialism. You should be supportive of the Gilets jaunes, the Canadian truckers, and of Brexit and things like that, because they're all part and parcel of the same movement. They're all part and parcel. They might be slightly different in their nuances and their aims and their goals and their leadership and all those other things, but they're always fundamentally, they're all working class movements.
Yeah,
and that's why you should support them.
Yes, and I have a feeling that had the TUC or the trade union leaders come out and said that they supported them, there'd have been a lot of trade unionists in Britain who would agree with them.
Yeah.
Who would say, my leader, Sharon Graham or whatever, has said she supports the Gilets jaunes, and I'm made up with that because that I support them because I believe in there. But they didn't, so they alienate themselves then from their own members because the members are wanting one thing, maybe Brexit or the Gilets jaunes in France, but the trade union leaders not backing them, not coming out and support with them. They alienate themselves from their own members.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in very simple terms, all I would like from a trade union leader is to look at any dispute anywhere and ask themselves, is this being led by the working class? And if the answer is yes, then we'll support it.
Yeah.
That's it. We'll support it. Doesn't matter where it is. Doesn't matter whether we have complete or incomplete agreement with some of their aims.
Yeah.
If it's led by the working class, we will support it. Done.
That's the whole thing. It's class. Working class anywhere in the world is working class. And if they're in strife, it's your duty to support them.
Exactly.
If you're in the position of a union leader and you can do something, then it's your duty to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that.
Sadly, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we'll move now to the foot of page 150 even, on challenging the power of global capitalism. So I'll quote as follows. And this is where the nation state comes in. For in the absence of either an international socialist revolution, a prospect which is neither likely nor, other than for a small number of hardline activists, extremely attractive, or serious reform of existing neoliberal and supranational institutions, which by and by and large, proved themselves unreformable to any meaningful degree. Any resistance must come from nation states enacting measures which have the potential to disrupt the status quo. They might do this in a range of ways. One is to weaken, where desirable, by seceding from those supranational institutions which seek to embed the precepts of globalization within national economies and legislation. Of course, that doesn't guarantee that an elected government won't then fill the space with its own version of domestic neoliberalism. The democratic principle does, after all, rightly compel us to accept the outcome of elections, but it does potentially undermine some of the fundamental pillars propping up the current system. That is one of the many, but nonetheless a key reason why the left should have led the charge for Brexit. Not because secession from the EU was ever an end in itself, but ultimately because it restored democratic control over wide areas of policy to the national parliament, cleared the path for the implementation of a more economic or radical economic programme by a future Labour government, and would have demonstrated that the left wasn't afraid to strike at globalisation where it was ostensibly strongest. So my reflections on that passage: firstly, Embery shows how he is not only a social democrat, he's an anti-Marxist, because Marxism is a revolutionary ideology. In his statement regarding international revolution being neither a prospect which is neither likely nor, other than for a small number of hardline activists, terribly attractive. Not to labour the point, but no revolution will begin internationally. History shows clearly that all workers' revolutions begin in the countries in which they take place. There was a Russian revolution, after all, and you know, don't want to go into the weeds about talking about Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, but the Russian Revolution had to start in Russia. It couldn't start in Germany. It had to start in Russia. History shows clearly not all workers' revolutions begin in the countries. All workers' revolutions begin in the country in which they take place. They are not precipitated by outside agitators, by the workers in the countries themselves, often led by an educated and motivated section of the working class. So he does identify that any nation that withdraws from an organisation like the EU, in so doing, will weaken that organisation and the imperialist network of states that it's part of. And he also identifies that withdrawal from that sort of organisation will not, in and of itself, lead to some sort of socialist transformation. So, and Embery's also correct that the left should have led on the Brexit question in favour of leaving the European Union.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Unfortunately, as the most uppermost levels of the left and the trade union movement are dominated, or at least strongly influenced, by Trotskyism, who conflate the European Union with internationalism, the vast majority of the left and the trade unions sided with Remain and labelled Brexit as a right-wing racist project of the ruling class, when the fact was that the ruling class arguably didn't even want a referendum, let alone Brexit.
Of course they didn't want that.
No.
We know this.
No, that's right. And we know for a fact that we will never, ever get a referendum in this country again unless the ruling class is absolutely certain that they know what the
going to win it. Yeah.
And we've seen in the past with referenda regarding the European Union in countries like Denmark and Ireland, where the ruling class didn't like the first result, so they just did it again until they got the right one.
Yeah, well, that's it. Keep going until you get the right answer.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very important to take that point on board, isn't it? Because there are so many leftists in this country who think that Scottish nationalism in and of itself must be a good thing. But we know that were it left to the Scottish nationalists, for instance, shortly after leaving the United Kingdom, they would then join the European Union and NATO. So your sovereignty's gone in a puff of smoke. And
sovereignty, as we know, we don't agree with the breakup of the British Isles. So they can talk about being nationalists or whatever, but they're part of Great Britain, and to try and think that they're not is ridiculous. I don't get this, to be honest. Devolution. I never really thought it was a good idea in the beginning, and I think I heard Alex say at one of his talks. I think he's of that opinion as well. But I remember when it came into Wales and people were going, "Oh, you know, Plaid Cymru were home rule for Wales." I said, "And what are you going to do? Sell holiday chalets?" You're going to hold Birmingham to ransom with water from Lake Vyrnwy. That's it. Or maybe Liverpool with a bit of water from the other lake up there, the Trousford Dam. Now, there's nothing there. Once the coal mines are gone, steelworks.
Exactly.
Well, so what is there?
The fundamental point about Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism or any sort of nationalism in a tiny island like ours is, you have a nation of 67 million people on a very small island with a common government, common culture, a common ruling class. Let's be fair. There's not a separate Scottish and English ruling class,
No.
and there hasn't been for hundreds of years. It makes no sense to take that small island with that common culture and that common ruling class and that common method of governance and start drawing lines all over it, saying, well, we'll have that bit, we'll have that bit, that bit, that bit, and we'll make them all separate. It doesn't make any sense. And again, I had this discussion with a chap online who was of the left, but was massively in favour of Scottish nationalism. But he was from Canada, and he said, well, we have a federal system in Canada and it works quite well. I said, but Canada's enormous. It's an enormous country. And the history of Canada's establishment as a nation is from bits of it being owned by different countries at different times in history. We've never had that situation in this country. We are a unified kingdom and have been for hundreds of years, and hundreds of years. It is ludicrous, like with the now practically defunct Northern Independence Party saying, oh, well, we'll draw a line, just north of Birmingham and say everything between there and Scotland's a separate country and Wales is a separate country with its own government. I mean, to pick up on your point about devolution, I think devolution in this country was the single biggest mistake that any government has made, probably since the Second World War. It's basically created a lot of the divisions that there are now in this country. It's created a lot of the animosity that exists between the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament. In as much as the Scottish National Party, when it was, obviously they've lost a lot of their seats in the London Parliament, but they still have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. But their laws were all set out to set themselves apart from Westminster. The driving force was we need to do something that Westminster won't. We need to do something that Westminster won't.
Yeah, that's it. It's ridiculous.
And that's all they did. And the crowning glory was, of course, their amendment to the Gender Recognition Act, which is a fantastic example, because a person in Scotland could, who was a man, could identify as a woman and then get in a car, cross the border into England, turn back into a man again.
Yeah, brilliant.
Legally. And it was that utter mess that started to unravel the premiership of Nicola Sturgeon and led to her demise. And it should be said that Scottish Labour voted in favour of that reform of the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland as well. They were all in on it as much as the Scottish nationalists were. But it goes to prove how foolish and how much of a folly devolution has been. Because it was originally a sop to try and head off any nationalism in Scotland. But all right, okay, the Scottish nationalists suffered a very heavy defeat in the general election in July, but they still hold this majority in Parliament, and they still are continuing to distance or put distance between themselves in London through legislation. And it's not necessarily in the interest of Scotland. It's in the interest of differentiating Scotland from everywhere else. And if you look at devolution on a more regional scale, so if you take, for sake of argument, the decision to make Sunderland a city, or to give it city status, they waited until Sunderland's coal pits and shipyards were closed before they gave them the city status, because they had nothing else. And essentially, what the government said to the city of Sunderland was, right, you take over, we'll give you city status, you manage your own decline now. We're not bothered
It's managed decline. That's exactly the right word for it.
Yeah,
That was
it's
devolution.
not devolution of power. It's
No,
devolution of decline. It's
that's
putting
correct.
the management of the decline of a city
Yeah,
in the laps of the people that live.
and to allow them to do that was a failing of Westminster government to allow to do that and think, right, well, you look after Wales, you look after Scotland. And I could see at the time this is going to cause no end of problems.
Yeah, yeah,
I just had envisaged in my mind the arguments that would have when I've got relations. My wife's sister and her husband have a caravan in not far from Carnarvon, in Carnarvon, and they were down there, and it was after COVID, and they went to the local Asda to get provisions because they were staying there for a week, and they went with a guy from the camp. He was collecting stuff, and this lunatic come up to him because he see the number plate on the car, obviously English, and he said, you give him down the bells. Well, my brother-in-law's not a giant. He's a mild mannered guy, so he shit himself. And I said, well, it's a good job because I was born in Wales. They're not, but they come along slagging people off who they don't even know. He's bringing money into Wales by having a bloody little holiday home there.
yeah,
Do you know
exactly,
what I mean? And
exactly.
that's all it is. It's holiday home. They don't want to take over the country. They're not depriving. I don't agree with people buying houses when people can't get them. In Wales. But a caravan. Come on, it's on a caravan site. Looks like anyone can buy a caravan, even a
Yeah,
Welshman and go and
exactly,
live in it.
exactly,
Jesus. But that's
exactly.
the sort of thing that it caused. This vicious animosity. And in my hometown, Aberystwyth, there's actually a pub on Bridge Street. I think they've stopped it now. But the last time I was down there was a few years ago. Went to a wedding. There's a pub on Bridge Street. I can't remember the name. It's in Welsh. But when you walk in, if you ask for a pint in English, they won't serve you.
Right.
That's how bad it is. Because it's this big student town,
Yeah.
and a lot of Plaid Cymru and Welsh nationalists come from that area.
Right. Right.
It's just one of them things. And it's a seaside town. There's nothing there. There's no big industry. Um, Tourism. That's it.
Yeah.
And yet they can have pubs that you can't speak. You know, you can't
Mm,
speak English in, which
nice.
beyond
Nice.
me. Like, but that's just an example of the hatred that it caused.
Well, that's it. Again, it's this whole notion of having a government in Wales or a government in Scotland that sets out from the outset to differentiate itself from the Westminster government by any
Yeah.
means necessary.
So
You know,
if they
so
decided in Wales or Scotland, and they all got together and they all freaking went on a general strike and wanted a revolution, how would that work then? Would they bring down the parliament in Scotland, but everything else we'd allow that?
well, that's it. I mean, you know exactly what would
Ridiculous.
happen if for sake of argument, you had some workers' revolution in Scotland and they burnt down the Scottish Parliament. Westminster would just take over, wouldn't they?
Of course they would. Yeah, of
Like that,
course they
you
would.
know. And they've got the paperwork to let them do it.
I
So
know.
yeah, exactly. Okay, we'll move on now because we've got quite a weighty list now of demands that Paul Embery is going to make. So
Yeah.
we're talking about now what sort of things Paul Embery thinks would happen if Britain were to fully adopt the notion of nation statehood. And I'll quote from the book. And what we'll do, I'll quote the first paragraph and then we'll go through each of the bullet points in turn. So, a left government acting in the British national interest and confident about using all the powers available to it, including those repatriated from the EU, could do much in the way of domestic policy to upset the existing global order. Okay. It could, for example, defy the neoliberal orthodox of the past 4.5 decades and take a much more economically interventionist approach by, so eyes down,
Yep.
reversing the privatisation of key utilities and industries and restating the case for public provision as a public good. Right, okay. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. We've got a Labour government in charge now, and that's not going to happen. I absolutely 100%
No,
guarantee it.
I agree.
Because in a nation that is completely deindustrialised, which is Britain 2024, the opportunities for making profit in industries in this country are vanishingly small, and there is, in my view, nothing that would persuade any government to nationalise key utilities and industries in this country. None.
Well, if you take the example we were looking at with the Royal Mail, that's a key utility, really, and there's no way, or reopen the coal mines
yeah,
under a government. Now, if you had a revolution, then you could decide to do all these things, but you're not going to do it with a right wing Labour Party who's in the hand pockets of the ruling class. In any case, we know
no, of
this,
course
don't
not.
we? And
No,
anyone
no,
who thinks this is a wish list, I get it, but yeah, it ain't going to happen. That's
no,
not
it's not.
happening.
And you know, let's go back to the example you gave earlier on about the railway industry. The railway industry was nationalised in 1947. Was it 1948? 1948, I think. 1948, and then partly renationalised when National Network Rail was brought into being. And on both occasions, the government was forced to do it. The government was forced to do it after the Second World War because the entire railway system was absolutely destroyed. Absolutely destroyed. It had track that was completely out of shape. It had rolling stock that was knackered. The whole railway network could not run and turn a profit at the same time. So the government had to step in and nationalise it. Now, when they closed down rail track and replaced it with Network Rail, that was fundamentally after the Hatfield crash. Yes, yeah, so the Hatfield crash in 2000, where the ownership of the rails was under the private company Railtrack, and it was found that Railtrack did not hold a central record of the state of its own infrastructure. It had devolved it down to contractors like Balfour Beatty. And so when they were asked by the railway inspectorate, what is this particular section of track like? They went, we don't know. And it was such a mess. And it had been building up for some time because obviously you had the Ladbroke Grove crash in West London, which was caused by poor sighting of a signal, which Railtrack refused to move because it was too expensive. The government was forced to do it. So the only way that a government will take any public utility or former publicly owned utility back into public ownership is if they have to. Thames Water is a good example. If Thames Water does eventually go under, which it looks like it might, it will be put back into public ownership, but only for as long as it gets itself back on its feet, changes its name maybe, and then they'll resell it.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, not because I know we're pressed for time, but what would public ownership look like in a capitalist society? Well, it will look like British Leyland, where you had Michael Edwards, who was the chief of British Leyland, going to war with the unions because it was run like a capitalist entity. It was just publicly owned. And it will be the same for all of them. You will just have some bigwig from the CBI get bunged in charge, and it'll be run as a capitalist entity just under public ownership.
Yes,
We have to be
exactly.
very, very careful. See, I've always argued I don't want nationalisation. I want socialisation. I want companies to be owned and controlled by the workers, not run by a CBI bigwig that the state appoints.
Well, the coal was the same with McGregor, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's
Doesn't work.
well, if you were to argue the case for a nationalised set of public utilities under this sort of system, that's what you'll get. You will get a publicly owned company run by capitalists on behalf of the capitalist state. So the next bullet point is to challenge the assumption that austerity is the correct response to a faltering economy and instead pursuing investment-led growth. Well, I would say my opening gambit is we've already discussed what the level of investment is in this country. It's nothing. It's nothing. Nothing. No private company invests money in Britain because the rate of return is awful. So it won't.
Yeah.
So
No,
that
no,
means the state is going to have to do it.
yeah. So that's not going to be done, is it?
No, no. We'll move quickly on to the next bullet point. Striving to end the decades-long overvaluation. Now this is an interesting one. Striving to end the decades-long overvaluation of sterling, which is decimating our manufacturing base and destroyed thousands of jobs by making British goods fundamentally uncompetitive in the international marketplace, thereby contributing to retarded productivity and a perennial trade deficit. Now, I interviewed Paul Embery about 4 years ago, and I asked him a trigonometry question, which was, what are we not talking about that we should be talking about? And he said exactly this. He said that sterling was valued too high, which makes us unattractive to export goods. Now, of course, you've got to make goods to export them, but that's a bridge we could cross perhaps at another time. But as it was, the pound was
Excuse me.
devalued somewhat by Brexit. But what's your thoughts on Embery's position regarding the value of the pound?
Yes, I do agree with it because but me agreeing and you agreeing or whatever, I know these points will not be done. So striving to end the decades-long evaluation, overvaluation sterling. How do you do that? How do you, what do you devalue the pound?
Yeah, basically,
Basically,
it would be the Bank of England devaluing the pound.
which has been done before.
Well, the only thing I would say is, if there was any notion that the pound would be devalued, then I suspect that the bond market would go through the floor, because you would have all kinds of governments and companies selling sterling bonds before the devaluation took place.
Well, it's the same as Eisenhower said
Yeah, exactly.
over
Exactly.
Suez. So it
Yeah,
doesn't suit the ruling class. They'll do other things to damage the
of
country, if
course.
you like, because it
Yeah,
doesn't suit them. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Um,
I mean, I do agree that to end, you know, to make British goods fundamentally more competitive in the international marketplace, but we don't fucking make anything.
no, exactly. Exactly.
So we can't sell our coal abroad because we don't have any, or
No,
our steel,
no.
or our ships.
Yep. And looking at those things, we don't dig our own coal, which makes it much more difficult to make steel, because you can only make steel with coal.
You're correct.
You
This
can't run a
bullshit that
blast furnace on anything but coal. No matter
no,
what
this
Miliband thinks, you can't. So
no,
you
this,
need coal to make steel, and you need steel to make ships.
yeah, and that's why they didn't want the last steelworks in South Wales. But I mean, they say, oh, it's electric. Well, I think there's a guy on the Wednesday, Lee Inchcliffe. I think he works in a steelwork and he said something about electric trying to make steel using electricity. He said you can't do it. You can melt
That's
slag steel,
yes.
cheap shit steel, but you can't make, say, proper steel for
No,
making a ship.
you need a
You
blast
need
furnace
a blast furnace with coal,
with
not a
coal.
fucking cigarette lighter.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. So let's move on to the next bullet point because it's a doozy. Instituting full employment rather than price stability as the prime goal of economic policy. Now, Terry, when would you say the age of full employment ended in this country?
Full employment. To be honest, I mean, how many on the dole now? Not sure.
And I'm not
Not
sure.
sure. But I don't think we've ever had full employment. I mean, you could say in the early 70s, everything or the late 60s, there was buildings going up, um, cities were being rebuilt.
I think it's fair to say
Oh,
that the only age or the age where we were closest to full employment was arguably between the end of the Second World War and about 1965.
yeah. Historically, you'd have to look into that for me. because I was only a child then, but from what I saw from growing up in the 50s, that every man and father of every friend I had went to work. And they worked in different places, and my dad worked on the buildings. Some guys worked on the docks. My wife's father worked on the docks in Ellesmere Port. They haven't got a dock in Ellesmere Port now.
No.
One of them, innit? But yeah, so yeah, arguably, you're probably right. And it started to go down. I know there was a lot of unemployment in the 80s because that was the threat, as we've said before, of if you don't do what you're told, there's a 3 million people out there who'll do it for
right.
you.
Exactly. I
But
get again though. Given the service driven nature of
yeah,
the economy in this country, I think it's going to be almost impossible to institute full employment unless you reshore industry. And as
would
we've
be
said before, reshoring industry would have to come from the state. The state would have to do it either by giving companies enormous tax breaks or enormous cash bribes to build factories over here.
well, we
And
know that's not going to happen. But
well, exactly.
if they want to have if it's full employment at what cost? Is it full employment on 0 hour contracts and minimum wage? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like retail parks built all around the nation, full of kids leaving school. Oh, we've got full employment in Britain. Yeah, but they're on 8 hours a week.
exactly.
They used to get more in pocket money off their dad
Mm,
when they were at school.
yeah, exactly. We'll move on to the next bullet point. Setting policy unambiguously in the interests of those who live and work in the real economy, where goods are produced and wealth created, and ending the long indulgence of the city and existing asset holders. Well, um, I cannot foresee any government that made that pledge ever being elected, because the full forces of the ruling class would be brought to bear upon them.
Yeah,
And again, this is something that quite easily could be done if you had a socialist revolution.
yeah, it's a worker state.
If you had a worker
Yeah,
state, you
yeah.
could close down the city tomorrow because you wouldn't
But
need it.
all these points would be applicable if you had a worker state. So when he says right at the beginning, a left-wing government acting in the British national interest, a left government. But what left? Have we got a left government now? Do we class the Labour Party as left? We don't. But do people think they're voting for socialism when they vote Labour? Surely then some people may. But a left government means a socialist government to me. But he's talking about the modern left despising the working class. I don't. So it's a bit of an ambiguous thing. If you had a workers' state or a socialist revolution, as you say, all these items, every item would be done.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But
Yep.
until you get that, you might as well write a million items on 1,000 pieces of paper.
Absolutely. The point I think is worth making is that this list of demands, like you said, would be eminently possible under a socialist government.
Yeah, if
But,
they decide to open
or
all the
rather, no,
pits,
let me rephrase that. In a workers' state,
workers'
not in
state,
under a socialist, in a workers' state, but in a bourgeois state like ours, no,
no chance.
none of these things are possible
You could start
because
off
the
with the,
interests of capital override all of these priorities,
all those they do,
all of
and
them.
that's the, yeah, that's the end product. If you started off with your state by opening the coal mines, you would then move on to using coal for blast furnaces. You would be making your steel, and it would build. You'd make your own trains. I know it's cloud cuckoo land, but if the state was there, it could be done.
Mm, yeah,
But
yeah.
as Embery said earlier on, the only reason we're ever going to get a socialist, he doesn't mention Marxist, does he? But he said it like a socialist revolution. It's not really wanted by anyone,
No, exactly.
apart from us, a few
So
fucking fanatics.
the one thing that he needs to have all this wish list, he doesn't want.
No, exactly. Yeah,
So we'll move on
we've
to the next
sussed that out,
point.
haven't we?
Yeah, exactly. Strengthening trade union rights as a means of to securing high wages and better workplace standards. Again, if you right, I would argue that, and I think we've had a discussion about this separately from here, but the what the role of the trade unions would be in a socialist state, in a workers' state, would be
Yeah,
completely different to what they are now. Essentially,
correct.
what trade unions do now under capitalism, they are defensive in nature. So what they're doing, they're always trying to push back against
Yes, they're a buffer
the
between the
predations
working.
of the ruling class all the time, and the employers trying to push back, push back, push back, try and keep themselves at least where they are now.
Hmm.
Try not to make things, excuse me, not to allow things to get any worse. What the trade unions would be in a workers' state is completely different. All of a sudden, what you would have is groups of workers who are the subject experts in the best way to run their place of work. So
Yeah,
the best placed people to know how to run a steel mill are the people that work in the steel mill. The best people to know how to run a fire service are the firefighters, not some paid bigwig who got
oh,
drafted in from some other business. You know,
yeah,
you know,
because they were shit at that, so they moved them on to
exactly,
some.
exactly. That's right. You know, or someone like Adam Crozier who ended up
Oh,
the Royal Mail.
I was just gonna
You know,
mention him
yeah,
actually.
exactly. You know, so the workers are the ones best, but then that's how trade unions should or would transform under socialism. They would all of a sudden become not necessarily workers' councils, but they would be organisations of workers who were subject experts in the field that they were trained and working,
Hmm,
not fighting back against the predations of their employers, because their employers wouldn't be predating them; they'd be their own employers essentially.
correct.
So moving on, uh, developing a sound industrial strategy, thus signalling that the government was determined to intervene on behalf of British industry rather than leave matters to the caprices and diktats of the market. Well, again, if you have a workers' state, that's
Yeah,
exactly what would happen. Um, that we would have a planned economy, a sound industrial strategy.
yeah, yeah.
But
That's
the whole point of capitalism is that to a greater or lesser degree, the state leaves matters to the caprices and diktats of the market.
yeah.
That's
It
how it
does.
works. Now, this is an interesting one. Implementing an immigration policy which allows for the maintenance of control of the labour supply, thereby easing downward pressure on wages, and planning around housing, welfare, and employment. What's your reflections on that one?
Downward pressure. Well, what it's saying is obviously if you've got no jobs, you can't have immigration, can you? Really, from what he's
Oh,
saying. But
well,
I don't get. Um,
I see. I would argue again under a capitalist system, there will be no incentive for the ruling class to curtail immigration. Okay,
no.
they need a constant supply of exploitable labour.
Oh
They
yeah,
don't
yeah.
care where that comes from. It could
No, they
come
don't.
from here
That,
or it could
yeah,
come from somewhere else. What they want is that labour. Okay. Now, as we've said before, we as a nation are not replacing ourselves at the correct rate. So
correct.
the shortfall is being made up by foreign workers being brought in from elsewhere. Capitalism will not stop that. Capitalism will not change that.
No.
You will not. You will not stop capital from importing labour in order to fill the breach left behind by us because we're not having enough children.
Hmm.
It just won't. It just won't. And every single government, be it the Tories, Reform, Labour, the Greens, the Lib Dems, whoever, will act in the interest of capital.
Yes,
Always.
but as we say, I mean, this list. Yeah, I see what the point, but it's it's if this fictitious, marvelous government that he's got, um, which was elected. Now, yeah, you could ask them to do these things, but like you've said, they wouldn't do them.
No.
They'll just carry on. You won't stop immigration because of what you've said with regards to replacement of our own, um, not having enough children. So you'd have to have immigration to continue on. But if there's no jobs, no work industry, there are no jobs for people to come to anyway.
Exactly. And if there's no jobs for people to come to, there's no immigration.
No. So
People don't come to this country to be unemployed.
no,
They come
exactly.
here on the promise of work. Now, I'm not necessarily saying whether all that work is over the table work or whether some of it's off the books kind of work. But they're coming here to work either
Mm.
way. They're not you would not go to a country where you didn't have a job to go to,
No. Why
or
would
at
you?
least a chance of a job to go to. Okay, so we'll move on to the next bullet point now. Allowing the Bank of England, under government direction, to create credit to serve the interests of productive industry, rather than leave lending as a virtual monopoly in the hands of private banks, which direct their funds overwhelmingly towards other priorities such as housing. Again, though, this speaks to the problems that we've spoken about repeatedly during this recording, which is that private finance in this country does not invest in anything that it doesn't think it will make a return on. So if you're given two options, one to invest your money in lending to companies, startups, and things like that, or lending to people buying property, they'll go for property every single time because the rate of return on property
Oh
under
yeah.
our system is far greater than giving it to a startup company,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
when you consider that startup company could fail and take
Yes.
the money with them. You know, look, I agree. I think you mentioned it earlier. I think one of the biggest mistakes the Blair government made, amongst many,
Mhm.
but one of the biggest, was to remove to give the Bank of England so-called independence. I think it's a nominal independence, but one thing that is true is that the democratic control of the Bank of England was taken away from the electorate.
Yeah.
You know, the if the Bank of England did anything wrong, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was responsible. Now, if the Bank of England do anything wrong, the government just looks at, well, not us. It's independent, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's fundamental to late stage capitalism to take um, as many departments of government out of democratic control as possible by spinning them off into agencies or giving them
Yeah. Yeah.
independence. That way, you can't change anything that they do, and you can't challenge anything that they do, and you can't get rid of the people that are in charge. So we'll move on. Committing to retain permanently its own independent currency. Yeah, I've got no problem with that. I mean, that actually isn't predicated on being in a capitalist or a socialist society
No.
anyway.
No.
I'll move on to the next one. In fact, we probably touched on a bit of this already. Restoring the
Yeah.
Bank of England to democratic control so that monetary policy is in the hands of elected politicians rather than unaccountable officials, and is designed to give effect to the government's wider economic programme for the real economy rather than submit to demands of a financial sector overly preoccupied with monetary targets. Yeah, I mean, I think in and of itself, it would be a progressive step to bring control of the Bank of England back under the executive, the government.
Yeah.
Whether it would lead to any of the other things that he says is open to debate,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
I think that would certainly, in and of itself, be a
Yeah.
progressive.
Well, we have criticised them for doing that, so to
Yeah,
bring it back
absolutely.
would be a step.
Yeah, exactly. And the final bullet point, this is a big one, so we'll go through it as best as we can. Implementing restrictions on the movement of capital as a means of mitigating the damaging effects to the economy, industries, and communities of significant and volatile flows of money in and out of the country, which include the all too frequent practice of foreign interests buying up our assets, driving down standards, and then repatriating profits. Capital controls are regarded as taboo by many, and not just free market enthusiasts, but the idea has received endorsement in the past from voices such as Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman and even, albeit to a limited extent, the International Monetary Fund. Ultimately, socialists must be prepared to call for controls over the movement of capital in the interests of working people. Big ask, isn't it? Big
Yeah,
ask under even the socialist in charge of a capitalist system. That's a big ask, isn't it?
definitely.
Big ask.
But uh, when the International Monetary Fund um, endorses any of your ideas, then you must be doing something
Well,
wrong.
you should be skeptical. Yes, certainly. Very, very skeptical. Um, so right, I'm just going to pause the recording there for a sec. Okay, so we'll move then to the bottom of page 161, and this is the point that we will wrap up our recording for today. So I shall quote directly from the book as follows. Some on today's left, and particularly the far left, would often recite slogans such as "Workers of the world unite" or "Build unions, not borders" when challenging the concept of nationhood and borders. But for many who resort to such sloganizing, the international class war is everything, and all things must be subordinated to it. This leads them to see workers both individually and in their relations with others, principally through the prism of their place in the economic structure, and by extension as some kind of off-the-peg battalion in the battle against capitalism. So they will deploy arguments along the lines of, we have more in common with each other than with the bosses, as though solidarity on the basis of class were the only thing that mattered. The problem with this approach, however, is that most people do not see themselves in this narrow way, not necessarily because they lack class consciousness, they do lack class consciousness, by the way, but simply because, for them, class is but one of a multitude of things that may inform their worldview or drive their relationship with others. These other things, language, culture, custom, tradition, heritage, nationality, religion, interests, hobbies, vocation, and so on, often matter just as much to them, sometimes more so, than class identity. And all of them have the capacity in some way to draw factors aside when determining their relationships and political opinions. And to insist that class be the primary or only concern is to assume that they attach to the class struggle a level of importance that is usually reserved only for the most politically committed. Like it or not, working class Labour voters may feel, a working class Labour voter may feel he has more in common with an owner of capital on account of the fact that they speak the same language, live in the same town, believe in the same God, drink in the same pub, and support the same local football team than he does with a fellow working class person with whom he holds none of these things in common. And so my notes say as follows. Research shows that class is a bigger barrier to success for people in this country than factors like race.
Yeah.
A report by the Policy Exchange published this month, this was in October, I should stress, found that ethnic minority individuals overwhelmingly thought that class was more important than race in determining whether a person would succeed in modern day Britain. So that's 54% saying class, 26% race. And
Yeah.
this held true over ethnic groups polled, over every ethnic group. And on this basis alone, it appears extraordinary that someone like Embery, who has written a whole book on the working class and how the modern left despises them, should in this passage try to push class politics down the list of priorities for working class people. Workers of all lands unite was the closing line of the Communist Manifesto, a political work written specifically for the working class. Why would any political activist wishing to work towards the emancipation of the working class from the wage system not quote that line?
Yeah.
Affinity through things like language, culture, custom, tradition, heritage, nationality, religion, interests, hobbies, vocations, and so on is all well and good. But for how long would this affinity persist when push comes to shove?
Yeah.
Michael Portello likes trains. Okay. I like trains. In that regard, we have something in common. But when I have to take sides between his class and mine, will I choose his class because he likes trains? Would he choose mine for the same reason? And this looks to me like the sort of social democratic claptrap that has helped destroy class consciousness, not only in the labour movement, but in the working class at large. Social democracy always seeks to build bridges between class enemies because it serves the interests of the ruling class. It is social democracy which advocates for tripartite arrangements, that's the workers, the employers, and the state working in partnership, which have already been exposed as a total failure when it was applied in this country in the 1970s.
Absolutely.
Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must pursue an compromising proletarian class policy, not a reformist policy of harmony in the interest of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, not a compromiser's policy of the growing of capitalism into socialism. And that's a Stalin quote for you. Class is certainly not the only concern, but it has to be the preeminent one. And one of the story I'm always reminded of when people talk about class and class consciousness and perhaps not being aware and then becoming aware of your class was something that Ricky Gervais said. Now, Ricky Gervais, now obviously a very wealthy and successful man, but he came from a fairly regular working class family in Reading in Berkshire.
Mm-hmm.
And he was lucky enough to be able to go to university, and he studied for a philosophy degree. And he said, I remember him distinctly saying this on a very old Radio X, or what was then XFM show he did back in the early noughties. He didn't know he was working class until he went to university. And it was only when he went to university that he realised that he really was working class, when he was talking to people who had different accents, come from different backgrounds, whose parents, his dad was a labourer and his mum was a housewife. You know, he had parents that had, or he was talking to people who had parents with completely different jobs, completely different roles, completely different world outlooks.
Yeah.
And that was the vital thing. I mean, it's all very well saying there are working class people who have friends down the pub that they have a lot in common with, but might be from different classes. But when you start to push and push on subjects where the two classes would be in conflict, then you'll find yourself falling out very, very quickly.
Yeah,
You're very well saying, well, all right, as long as you confine your conversations to football or whatever else it is that you have in common, then that's all well and good. But life's not about confining your conversations to things like that, is it?
No, no, it isn't. You're right. It is class, and that point that you make,
I mean,
yeah, there it is. Workers of all lands unite, closing the Communist Manifesto. Political work written specifically for the working class. At this point, why would any political activist wishing to work towards the emancipation of the working class from the wage system not quote this line? Sums it up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's
Class.
I find it quite a challenge to get my head around a book like this, which is Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, and then seek to push class politics down the list over things like, well,
Hobbies.
what cobblers? What cobblers did he list? Let's have a look.
Hobbies and
Yeah, you know, he wants
we
people
both
to be
play golf,
united
but the
by
back.
things like language, culture, custom, tradition,
Yeah.
heritage, nationality, religion, interest, hobbies, vocation. The whole right. So, and again, we've said this before, but we'll say it again. We've worked in workplaces where all of those things, language, culture, custom, tradition, heritage, and so on, all secondary. We as workers are less bothered by your culture, your customs, your traditions, your heritage. It's that you're working in the same place as me and you're the same class as me. All
Correct.
those other things are secondary.
When you're all standing outside the gate, putting your arms in the air, there's no colour, class, or religion.
Exactly.
You're all workers and you're going on strike. That's
Yep.
it for me. That's
Exactly.
class.
And it's something I did a film review of a documentary called Am I Racist? Which was done by a conservative commentator called Matt Walsh. And he went to a biker's bar and talked to the down at heel people that were there. And the vast majority of the people that he spoke to said, well, I'm not bothered about the colour of your skin. It's how good a person are you? What kind of person are you? Are you a good person? That's all that matters. I mean, essentially what they were saying was the Martin Luther King line, which was that he had a dream that a man would be judged by the content of his character and not the colour of
Not the
his skin.
colour of his skin.
You know, working class people already know this.
Yeah.
They already know this, you know. I mean, and I do believe that class consciousness has been severely eroded. And a penny dropped. I was listening to an interview that Alex of the Marx Engels Lenin Institute did with a reporter. I think she's a journalist from Georgia, and she said, I'm not going to paraphrase. I'll paraphrase it rather than quote.
Yeah,
I
I
can't remember
saw
the
it.
exact quote, but she said they destroyed class consciousness in Georgia by destroying the industries. By giving workers nowhere to work, they destroyed their class consciousness. You know, look at class consciousness in this country before the miners' strike and look at it after.
Oh, exactly. But they know what they're doing. It's all come off the same book.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And this is why, when you look into leaders to teach teachers like Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Castro, then you want them to be telling you the things that you should be following. So your trade union leaders, your socialist MPs, they should be following them things for you, but they don't. And
Yeah.
that's where the class consciousness gets eroded when you look at your MP and you think, he's not even the same class as me. He's
No.
on mega money.
Well, you only have to look at some of our modern, in fact, not just some, the majority of our modern day politicians to see how out of place and how uncomfortable they are in settings that you or I, as working class people, feel completely at ease in.
Oh,
So
yeah.
they
Drama at a
often look
football
like
match.
they've taken a wrong turn into a bad neighbourhood, and had no idea where they're supposed to stand, who they're supposed to talk to, how they're supposed to talk to them, how they're supposed to act. They're completely ill at ease in those circumstances, which is why, like it or not, people like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage endear themselves to certain sections of the working class. It's because they don't look ill at ease. You know, when you see someone like Nigel Farage in a pub having a pint, or you see Donald Trump in McDonald's making fries, and look at he's doing it. And then you compare it to people like Sakir Starmer, who looks completely
Oh,
out of place in a working class setting.
he's an
Completely out of place.
Arsenal fan, but he has to go in the box because people might abuse him if he goes
Yeah,
in the flicking
exactly.
crowd.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
I'd abuse him for being an Arsenal fan. Never
Yeah,
mind.
so would
So,
I. So would I. But no, I've got to say on that point, I fundamentally disagree with Embery and his analysis. I think it's important to put class as high up the list as possible,
yes.
because without class consciousness, without understanding your place within the system, you will never ever overthrow the system. And if you're trying to create, you know, a hippie commune where we're all friends with each other, despite the fact I'm having a drink with the man who's exploiting me and
Yeah.
taking the value of my labour to line his nest with, then I'm afraid that politically they're not going to get anywhere with that attitude,
No,
that
I
approach. It's
agree.
just not
I
going to
agree.
work. So I think we've reached the end of chapter 4 of Paul Embery's book Despised, Why
Yeah.
the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. And we have one final chapter to tackle.
Very happy.
So on our next episode, we will be tackling the rather aptly titled What is to be Done?
Yes.
Not quite the Lenin book, but
No, not quite.
it's Paul Embery's blueprint on what will be done in a future Paul Embery type world. And on that bombshell, we shall
Happy
leave it there.
days.
Happy days. Join us again for the final episode of our book review of Paul Embery's book Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, available on Polity Books. My latest article is a review, as I said a few moments ago, of Matt Walsh's documentary Am I Racist? Also look out, hopefully soon, for my, I believe, controversial article in praise of Wetherspoons. But in the meantime, I shall say goodbye and good night to you, Terry. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, pleasure, Jason. See you
Pleasure
next
as
time.
always. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, good night, Jason.
Bye bye.
Bye, mate.